The day is already fading. And now, in the stillness of evening, I invite you to rest, to set aside everything that tugged at you today. You are safe here, and you are not alone. My name is Duncan. I was born in the year 1592. Yes, I've lived a long time, longer than most would believe. Some call it a curse, others a miracle. I simply call it life. More than 4 centuries of wandering, watching, remembering. And now I tell stories to help you fall asleep. Quiet stories, warm ones, drawn from moments I witnessed, moments that mattered. So if you haven't yet, I gently invite you to subscribe to the channel and tap the little bell so that the next story finds you when you're ready to rest again. And in the comments, would you tell me what kind of stories you'd like to hear? And also, when do you go to bed? And in what time zone do your dreams begin? Now, close your eyes. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath settle. Let go of the need to hold the world tonight. And walk with me back to a quiet Sunday afternoon, to a time when the light filtered through autumn leaves, and I found myself strolling beside Eleanor Roosevelt. We did not speak often, but what we did say was worth remembering. She had invited me to walk with her that day, though I suspect she invited the silence more than the company. Eleanor was not fond of spectacle. Her soul was one of shadows and strength, like velvet curtains drawn across a window to quiet the room. We walked slowly. She moved with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her eyes took in everything: the wind in the leaves, the slant of the afternoon sun, a broken stone on the path. And then, without preface, she said, "Dignity isn't something you inherit. It's something you practice until it lives in your bones." I let her words hang there in the air between us. Some people speak to be heard. She spoke to be understood by herself, just as much as anyone else. "You see," she went on, "people often think dignity is about posture or reputation. But I believe it's quieter than that. It's the way you remain yourself in uncomfortable spaces." She bent slightly and brushed her fingers against a withered hydrangea, faded from summer's bloom. It's how you carry yourself when you're unseen, how you treat someone who can't give you anything. The afternoon deepened. Shadows of maple branches danced on the gravel path beneath our feet. I asked her if she'd always thought this way. She gave a soft chuckle. "Oh no," she said. "I was a frightened girl. I used to hide behind books, behind other people's words. But then life began to ask more of me. And I realized Dignity doesn't make you louder. It makes you clearer. There was something timeless about the way she said it, as if she wasn't speaking only to me, but to some quiet future, perhaps even to you. Take a moment. Let her words breathe inside you. What does dignity mean to you? Is it something you show the world, or something you offer to yourself when no one else is watching? She told me a story then, simple but unforgettable. It happened in the White House during one of the formal dinners. A young maid had dropped a silver platter, and the room went silent. The kind of silence that judges. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She rose, walked across the room, and knelt beside the girl to help her gather the pieces. She didn't need correction, Eleanor said. She needed someone to stay beside her while she found her breath again. It was then I realized dignity, as she practiced it, wasn't lofty. It wasn't cold or polished. It was something far more tender. It was choosing presence over performance, staying human in moments when it's easier to step back. We walked a while longer through the rustling woods, neither of us speaking, and yet everything felt said. Even trees have dignity, she murmured as we reached a clearing. Not because they tower, but because they stand, and they do so without apology. The wind turned cooler, brushing against our sleeves. A crow called in the distance, and Eleanor glanced at me, her expression unreadable, but warm. "There's too much noise in the world," she said. "Sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is to be still." And with that, we turned back toward the cottage. The sun had dropped lower now, tracing golden light across the fields. We did not rush. There was no need. But just before we reached the porch, she said something I never forgot. "Patience," she whispered, "is dignity stretched over time. Most people miss it because they're too busy running past it." And so, our Sunday walk continued into the long, slow unfolding of patience. Some lessons in life arrive like lightning, but others arrive the way morning mist rises over the fields, slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly, until you're surrounded by it. That is how Eleanor Roosevelt taught me about patience. Not with speeches or slogans, but with footsteps, pauses, and tea that was never rushed. As we reached a shaded spot behind the house, she motioned toward a simple wooden bench, nestled under a cherry tree, already shedding its leaves. She lowered herself onto the bench with care, smoothing her skirt as she sat. "Do you mind if we stay here a while?" she asked. "Not at all," I said. "Good," she smiled. Patience thrives when nothing needs to happen. We sat in silence for several minutes. I remember the rustle of squirrels in the branches, the distant hum of a passing car, and the slow, deliberate way Eleanor unwrapped a piece of hard candy and tucked it into her cheek like a secret. Then she said, almost as if to herself, "Everyone thinks patience is waiting. But it isn't. Waiting is passive. Patience is something else entirely. It's active. It's choosing not to interfere, even when every part of you wants to." She reached into a cloth bag beside her and pulled out something unexpected: yarn and needles. I must have looked surprised, because she chuckled. "Did you know I knit every day?" she asked. "It's how I think. Every stitch is a choice. Every row is progress, barely visible at first, but building toward something." And there it was, a metaphor as soft as the wool in her lap. "People assume that knitting is boring," she went on, "but it teaches you something rare. You can't rush it. If you do, you drop stitches. You unravel. You start again." I found myself watching her hands move, not fast, but steady, steadier than the wind. And suddenly, the conversation felt less like dialogue and more like rhythm, a weaving of thought. "Patience isn't about how long you can wait," she said. "It's about how present you can remain while waiting." Take a moment. Let that thought settle. How present are you truly? When you're in between decisions, between milestones, between versions of yourself. Eleanor spoke then of her time during the war. She told me how difficult it was to hold back when she disagreed with policy, or when she felt the pull to speak out prematurely. "But timing matters," she said. "Even the right truth, at the wrong time, can wound." She gave an example. A woman who had written to her during a food rationing crisis, begging for help. Eleanor didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't care, but because she wanted to bring the concern into a policy discussion without turning the woman's private struggle into a public statement. "It took 10 days, she said quietly. "But when I finally spoke, the change was real. It lasted. If I had rushed in, I might have been dismissed." That kind of patience, strategic stillness, I thought, was something rare. In an age of urgency, Eleanor had cultivated the art of quiet motion, like rivers beneath ice, like seeds in cold earth. She looked up at me then. "Do you know what else patience gives you?" I shook my head. "Kindness," she said. "The kind that doesn't need to be noticed." And for a while, we both listened to the wind passing through the trees. Time moved differently beside her. Not slower exactly, but deeper, more considered, as though every minute had its own temperature, its own mood. Impatience, she said softly, is often just fear wearing a mask. But patience is a vote of confidence in what's to come. I thought of how many leaders I'd known in my long life, emperors, kings, generals, so many undone not by enemies, but by haste. And here was this woman, quiet, gentle, powerful, building change not through thunder, but through the steady drizzle of endurance. As we rose from the bench and resumed our walk, Eleanor tucked her knitting back into the cloth bag. Not everything needs to bloom at once, she said. Sometimes rest is the most radical act of all. And just then, we turned the corner and came upon a scene so simple it made me smile. The back steps of the cottage, with a weathered welcome mat, and the faint smell of bread baking inside. She gestured toward it and said, "Now, I'd like to talk about something just as powerful as patience, but even more misunderstood. Comfort. Not the indulgent kind, the kind that heals. It's a strange thing, how the soul recognizes comfort long before the mind does." We had come around the side of the cottage when Eleanor stopped. She placed a hand lightly on the railing, her fingers brushing the worn grain of the wood. "You know," she said, "people think of comfort as cushions or fireplaces or soft blankets. But that's not it. Real comfort," she looked at me, "is when a place makes you feel honest. When you can put down the weight you didn't even know you were carrying." Inside, somewhere in the distance, a kettle sang. Not sharply, but like a memory returning. She didn't hurry toward it. She stood quietly for a moment, her gaze resting on nothing and everything at once. "Home," she whispered, "is a place where your voice comes back to you, softer, and the walls know you." I've visited many homes over the centuries, palaces built to impress, huts built to survive. But rarely had I encountered a home built for the soul. That's what Eleanor had made at Hyde Park. Not a showplace, not a political stage, but a breathing space, something human. "Even the rugs here are a little frayed," she said with a smile, opening the door for us both. "I like that. Things that are too perfect make people stiff." Inside, the cottage was filled with small signs of care. Mismatched teacups stacked neatly, a basket of mending beside a chair, photos of people not famous, but familiar. "This house," she said, "wasn't built to impress. It was built to hold." That line stayed with me. To hold your weariness after travel, to hold conversations that matter, to hold grief gently, to hold joy without clenching. We settled at a small table by the window. Outside, the trees danced slowly, each leaf a letter written in gold. She poured tea and added a touch of lemon, just so. "Do you know," she said, "when Franklin died, people assumed I would leave here, start over somewhere new. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because this place didn't belong to our marriage. It belonged to something older, something that made me myself." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity and warmth. "Comfort isn't about escaping the world," she continued. "It's about creating a space where the world doesn't have to wear armor. Take a moment. Let that idea drift across your own memories. What spaces in your life allowed you to disarm, to speak without rehearsing, to breathe without bracing?" Eleanor believed that comfort was a civic virtue, that it wasn't indulgence, it was infrastructure. "You can't expect people to care about society," she once said, "if they've never known what it feels like to be cared for." And so, at Hyde Park, she created rituals of welcome. Afternoon tea served not to elites, but to labor leaders, writers, immigrants, young girls. She offered the same cup to all. No fanfare, no ranking. Because, she explained, when someone sits in your kitchen, they stop being an issue. They become a person. She told me about a young visitor once, a nervous intern who dropped his tea onto the rug. He was horrified, expecting reprimand. Eleanor simply leaned down, dabbed the spot with a cloth, and said, "Well, now it's a lived-in home. You've helped." It was these tiny gestures, invisible to the world, that shaped her legacy far more than any speech. A hand on a shoulder, a second slice of bread offered without asking, a lamp left on late, just in case. I asked her once if she ever regretted not living grandly. She looked at me, eyes clear. "Oh, but I do live grandly," she said. "My home comforts people, and comfort changes things." As the kettle grew quiet and the sky dimmed beyond the window, I felt something unusual, something I had not felt in decades. I felt received, and I thought of all the homes in history that had changed the course of nations. Most were not castles. They were rooms like this, with chipped teacups and the smell of something baking, with someone like Eleanor, who understood that revolution begins with welcome. She poured me one more cup and asked gently, "Do you know the secret to making a place feel like home?" I shook my head. She smiled. "Leave space for someone else's story." And just like that, she stood. Her knees stiffened slightly, but she didn't mind. She walked back toward the porch where the last sunlight lingered. As we stepped outside, she looked up toward the edge of the sky. "You know," she said softly, "most people think silence is what you get when there's nothing left to say. But I think sometimes silence is the best thing you can say." And so we continued, walking gently into the quiet and into a deeper kind of conversation, one where words were no longer the stars, but the space between them. Some silences are heavy, some are brittle, but the silence that followed Eleanor Roosevelt was full. It followed her not because she demanded it, but because she allowed it. She never rushed to fill a pause, never tried to outpace discomfort. Instead, she listened to others, to the space around her, even to herself. She treated silence not as absence, but as a companion. As we walked into the edge of the woods, the sky took on that peculiar color between silver and gold, the kind that makes you unsure whether it's almost day or almost night. A bird called once and then stopped. Even nature seemed to yield the moment to quiet. "You know," she said, stepping carefully over a crooked root, "I've learned more from silence than from most books." I looked at her. "What kind of silence?" "The kind," she said, "that doesn't need permission to exist. The kind that makes room for truth. Not the loud kind. The kind that's too shy to show up in noise." I've heard many philosophies on silence over the centuries, but Eleanor's was different. To her, silence wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was a deliberate presence, a vessel. She stopped walking and rested her hand on the trunk of an old beech tree. "There's a story," she said softly, "about a woman who asked me why I didn't respond immediately when I heard an injustice had been done. She assumed I didn't care. But the truth was, I was listening. I was listening for something deeper than my own reaction." She looked up into the branches, where the leaves rustled just enough to remind us of breath. "There's power in silence, but not the power to dominate, the power to receive, to consider, to absorb without immediately dividing. Take a breath here. Let the hush wrap around you. Think of the last time you truly listened, without planning what to say next." I asked her how she used silence in her work. She told me about sitting through long meetings, public hearings, even personal conflicts, saying little at first. "When you withhold your opinion," she said, "people assume you don't have one. That's their mistake. What they don't see is the decision being formed in the quiet." She was not a passive observer. Far from it. But her silence was active, toned like a muscle. She used it to disarm, to prepare, to level the ground. "I once left a room," she said, "when a speaker refused to acknowledge the humanity of everyone present. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I just stood and left. And afterward, people asked what statement I had issued. She smiled slightly. I had already made it. That moment, she told me, taught her that sometimes silence is the statement. It says, 'This will not be dignified with my participation. This will not use my voice as its host.'" We paused near a small clearing where the light poured through the canopy like honey. Eleanor took off one glove and rubbed her fingertips together. "Silence," she said, "helps me feel the edges of what I believe. Sometimes you don't know how you feel about something until you stop talking long enough to hear yourself feel it. There's a kind of alchemy in that, a transformation that begins in restraint, in letting the noise fall away long enough for wisdom to speak. She told me of nights writing alone in her study, the radio off, the house quiet, a single lamp burning. Those were the hours, she said, when her clearest thinking happened, when there was no need to perform. "Most people are afraid of silence," she said, "because they're afraid of what will speak from inside it." But she wasn't. She had befriended that space, made peace with what it revealed. And in doing so, she created room for others to speak, to feel heard. Not just by her, but by the silence itself. Let that linger with you. What would your thoughts sound like if they didn't have to shout to be noticed? As we began to walk back toward the cottage, Eleanor slowed. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grasses at the forest's edge. "The world doesn't need more noise," she said at last. "It needs more quiet people with strong hearts." And then, almost as if by design, the wind fell still. No more needed to be said. We moved in silence for several minutes. Not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence. And when we emerged from the trees, the air was cooler. The day had aged. She turned to me and said gently, "You know, most people think becoming means changing. But I think sometimes becoming means staying." And that led us toward one last reflection on how staying can be its own kind of becoming. There is a silence that waits, and a silence that watches. But there is also a silence that sees. After our walk through the trees, Eleanor led us toward a quiet patch behind the house, an open space where nothing appeared arranged, yet everything felt placed with care. The garden was a little overgrown. A few chairs sat at odd angles beneath the trees. A watering can leaned into a bed of lavender. She sat on a low bench and said, almost to the air, "You know, it's one thing to be looked at, and another to be truly seen." I waited. That kind of statement doesn't ask for interruption. She ran her finger along a wooden armrest. People saw me often. Crowds, cameras, columns, but very few saw me. Not because they were unkind, but because they already thought they knew who I was. Her voice wasn't bitter, only thoughtful. "It's easy," she continued, "to live in performance, to become the version of ourselves that others already expect." And then she looked at me with something like amusement. "But the soul," she said, "won't perform for long. Eventually, it longs to be recognized, not applauded." That idea lingered in the air between us, like the dust dancing in the shafts of sunlight. To be recognized, not admired. I asked her what it meant, truly, to see someone. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked toward a small stack of firewood beside the tool shed. "There was a girl once," she said, "quiet as a shadow. She came to a reading group I hosted in the library. She never spoke. One day, I sat beside her and asked nothing, just listened to her turn pages. She turned slightly toward me. She told me later that it was the first time she ever felt real." Eleanor returned to the bench and sat again. "We're trained to respond to loudness," she said, "but it's the quiet souls who carry the heaviest things. When you see someone, really see them, you offer a kind of shelter." She spoke of refugees, of factory workers, of children on trains with no destination but hope. She spoke of how most of them didn't need answers. They needed acknowledgement. They needed to know, she said, that their lives weren't invisible. Take a moment. Think of someone in your own life who has gone unseen. Perhaps not on purpose. Perhaps they're the kind who smiles quickly, listens deeply, and vanishes politely. Have you ever really looked at them? She turned toward me with a quiet kind of firmness in her voice. To be seen is the beginning of belonging. Without it, dignity withers, patience dries out, even comfort feels hollow. I thought of the many lives I had passed by across centuries, without pause, without gaze, and how many had simply wanted to be known, just enough to exist. Eleanor looked out across the grass. "I never tried to fix people," she said. "I tried to notice them. That's where change begins." Then she smiled again, one of those inward smiles that seems to bloom just behind the eyes. "There is something holy," she said, "about recognition. It says, you are not lost in this world. It says, I see you, and I will not look away." The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long shadows that reached slowly across the field like fingers stretching for rest. And I knew then that her quiet power came not from being seen by millions, but from seeing one person fully, gently, and without judgment, again and again and again. As we stood to return to the house, Eleanor rested her hand lightly on my arm. We do not change the world by being seen by many, she said. We change it by seeing one another well. And just like that, we stepped back onto the path and into the final thought of the day, not about movement, but about staying, not about change through departure, but about becoming slowly through presence. Change is easy to preach, much harder to practice, especially when the world is watching. We had returned indoors for a while. The light outside had faded into blue, and Eleanor had invited me to sit with her in a narrow study, lined with books. The air smelled of old paper and lemon balm. She held a letter in her hands, not to read, but simply to remember. You know, she said, people think strength is never backing down. But I think real strength is knowing when you've been wrong. There was no shame in her voice, just honesty, and something softer, almost a kind of reverence for what it means to change. She placed the letter gently on the table and folded her hands. I've believed things in my life that I later abandoned, she said. Not because I was weak, but because I grew. And growing meant learning I didn't know everything. I stayed quiet. These were not lines rehearsed for applause. These were confessions offered without fear. She spoke then of the time she first supported segregated spaces in certain wartime programs, believing, as many did, that compromise was necessary, and how, after listening, really listening, to Black nurses, soldiers, and mothers, she changed her position entirely. I didn't issue a statement, she said. I just started working differently and letting my silence be replaced with action. She turned to me then and asked, "Have you ever mistaken certainty for wisdom?" I nodded. Of course I had. We all do. But in my long life, I had rarely seen someone so willing to hold their beliefs lightly enough to revise them, yet firmly enough to live by the new ones. Eleanor poured tea, neither of us needing sugar, and spoke of her work at the United Nations, of nights sitting up late with translators and human rights delegates, hearing stories from people whose lives bore no resemblance to hers. I could have held to my old worldview, she said, but then I would have missed them, missed what they had to teach me, and that would have been a failure of imagination. take a moment here. Let this settle. Changing your mind isn't weakness. It's what happens when you let someone else's truth shape your own. She reached for a pen on the table, then put it down again. Her fingers lingered on the wooden grain. I write letters sometimes, she said, to my past self, not out of regret, but gratitude, because she carried me as far as she could, and then let me go. There was something in her words that made the whole room feel slower, wiser. She spoke of a young man she had once dismissed, believing his ideas were naive. And then, she said, I watched the world catch up to his dream and realized I'd been behind. But instead of defending her earlier view, she had written him a note, thanking him for holding the light steady long enough for her to see it. Pride, she said, is afraid of change. But dignity knows how to kneel before a better idea. That sentence stayed with me long after the tea cooled. Dignity knows how to kneel before a better idea. We said nothing for a while. Just let the silence do its work. The kind of silence not empty, but ripe. Then she laughed softly. You know, people think age hardens you, but it doesn't have to. I've never felt more flexible than I do now. That, too, was a kind of courage. To live long and still be moved. To hold convictions like glass, not to be shattered, but examined against the light. She looked out the window, where a single light from the barn flickered faintly through the dusk. Tomorrow, I may believe something better than I do today, and I hope I'll have the courage to welcome it. And then she stood. No dramatic gesture, no summing up, just the quiet rustle of her skirt, and the sense that something essential had just passed between us. We stepped outside into the indigo air. The path was familiar now, the steps well worn. And as we walked toward the porch once more, she turned to me and said, Now you understand. Becoming isn't about never changing. It's about choosing the changes that make you more yourself. Which brings us, at last, to the slow, final turn of our Sunday walk. Not toward something new, but toward something enduring. A return, a route, a place to stay. Not all journeys lead us away. Some bring us inward. Some bring us home. We walked slowly now, Eleanor and I, the hush of twilight folding around us like a shawl. The day had said what it came to say. There was nothing left to prove, and everything left to hold. She paused by the wooden railing of the porch and placed her hand on it like an old friend. The same boards she had painted, the same steps she had swept in summer. And I could feel it, what it meant to stay. I used to think Becoming meant doing something, she said softly. Writing, traveling, leading. But now, I think it also means being still long enough for who you are to catch up. She turned her face toward the wind, just slightly, and smiled. Becoming is a kind of listening. And there it was, the thread that tied it all together. Dignity, patience, comfort, silence, recognition, change. All of them had led us here, not to a destination, but a still point, a quiet resting place within the self. We sat together on the porch, the boards creaking gently beneath us. Inside, a single lamp glowed through the window. The world had narrowed into warmth, and I realized something. Eleanor Roosevelt hadn't become herself by chasing something grand. She had become herself by staying with what mattered, staying with people others abandoned, staying with her questions, staying with her discomfort, and growing roots in the very ground that had once felt uncertain. Take a moment here. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let these words not just land in your ears, but in the quiet of your chest. What have you stayed with long enough to become? The wind had stilled. Even the trees seemed at peace. Eleanor rose quietly, pressed her hand to mine for a moment, and disappeared into the gentle light of her home. And I remained on the porch for a while longer, listening to the silence she had left behind. Not empty, not lonely, but full, complete, and deeply kind. And now, dear one, if you haven't yet subscribed, you are most gently invited to do so. And you may tap the bell, so the next story will come find you again when it's time to return to stillness. And in the comments, I'd be honored if you'd share, what kind of story would you like to hear next? And if you would, tell me, what time do you usually fall asleep? And in what part of the world you close your eyes each night? Because even across time zones, across centuries, across lives, we're not so far from each other when the lights go out. So rest now. You've wandered far enough for one evening. Rest well. Good night.